Good afternoon, Mr. Ranscht.
Good afternoon.
And we'll have you start your opening remarks once our clock keeper is ready to go. All right.
I used to have that job, so I know the importance.
All right. Whenever you're ready. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of the commissioners. I'm extremely grateful to be able to speak with all of you today. In my first legal job, I got as a gift a quote of the day calendar. I'm sure you know the kind of thing I'm talking about, a nice pad of paper. It's got a quote on it every day. You tear it off, you read it, you appreciate it. And more often than not, that's exactly what I did. I would read the day's quote, appreciate its perspective or its history or whatever the case may be, and then I'd recycle it and move on to the next day. But a few times, there was a quote that particularly stood out. And one of them stood out because to me, it wasn't really about perspective. It wasn't really about advice, and it wasn't even about wit, which I also would have appreciated. This one, I read it as a challenge. So it's one of many that I kept, and I have it here. And the quote is, "The best minds are not in government. And if they were, business would hire them away." And the categorical nature of that is what really, really struck me. The best minds are not in government, period. Now, I disagree with that vehemently. The best minds can be in government. Some of the best minds are in government, and the best minds are also in government. Business has many. Business has many best minds, many great minds. But government isn't, and it shouldn't be, excluded from having the best minds willingly in its service. And so I decided back then, all the way back then, to try to prove that quote wrong on a daily basis in what was at the time a government position. I wanted to be, through effort, through dedication, through loyalty, that kind of best mind that is willingly serving in government and being a solution. And so I've continued to make that a point of my practice, or at least trying my hardest to make it a point in my government practice with the Attorney General's office. Government service is really important to me, and it's a big part of what animates my application today. The judicial branch, I recognize and I really appreciate. It is about Iowans, pretty simply helping Iowans resolve their disputes and resolve them fairly. And there's a lot of honor in that task. Government service is also part of the reason I didn't get to speak with many of you before today. For the last, much of the last 2 weeks, I was in a very hard-fought jury trial. I was one of several lawyers representing the state in a case that was taking place in Iowa City. And that consumed most of my days in the courtroom and, frankly, most of my nights preparing for the next day in the courtroom. But that work was hard, but it was worthy. And I remained dedicated to it, even with this interview on the horizon here. Government service and that loyalty to seeing the job through and seeing the job done. Those both were and are extremely important to me. So the upshot of my application is this: the openings for an appellate position, and I have appellate experience in spades. I had my first oral argument before the Iowa Supreme Court just a few months into my tenure at the Attorney General's office. I've continued to handle multiple appeals a year, and even my district court practice is partially appellate because of the nature of judicial review of agency actions. And actually, in fact, I've got an oral argument next week, so as soon as I'm done here, I'm going to go start preparing for that. All of these things, though, these contribute to my ability to continue my effort toward being a best mind in government in the role of judge on the Court of Appeals. I would be humbled to receive your nomination, and I am happy to answer any questions you may have.
We're going to start our questioning with Commissioner Spies.
Good afternoon, and welcome. Thanks again for applying for this position, very important one. You know, what really stood out in reviewing your application is your experience with Justice Hecht, a superlative member of the court, and you were with him during some very important days in his life as well. What came away for you in your work with him?
Yeah, superlative is absolutely the right word for Justice Hecht. And what came away from my time with him, and I told him this as he was retiring from the bench, is he was great at many things. He was a great lawyer. He was then a great judge. He was a great mentor to me and to many others who worked in his service on the court. And just more importantly than that, he was a great person as well. And the thing I took away from him, learning in depth with him for 2 years, is that he was really, even as a judge, intent on helping me learn how to be a better lawyer, and also in showing me how to be a better lawyer. And he did that in many ways with his calm demeanor and his temperament. And I have tried to emulate that very much so in my practice. That was the number one takeaway from him. I think about him often, and I miss him a lot. But he taught me a lot, and I want to carry those lessons forward.
Thank you.
Commissioner Roberts.
Thank you. David, you have some appellate experience. Talk about the importance of appellate experience from your perspective for the next person to fill the vacancy on the court. Maybe as part of that, talk about sort of the skill set you think is important for being an appellate court judge.
Well, temperament, again, is a really important skill. So is the ability to handle the workload. I argue enough cases and brief enough cases to the appellate courts that I know the workload is, maybe this isn't it's a very technical term, but insane for the Court of Appeals. And so someone that knows how to write clearly, how to identify the issues, and how to communicate them in a clear way are some of the most important qualities I think someone should have.
Thank you.
Commissioner Parrish.
Mr. Rich, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to interview you, but I think I had a trial 2 weeks before in Lynn County, and then your trial started in Johnson County. But I'm curious, with your work for the government and in the appellate division, what have you learned from your losses of appeals that you think you can apply and would be make you a good Court of Appeals judge?
The number one thing from those losses is perspective. Sometimes I have lost a case, and there's no motion to change the facts. Sometimes the facts just aren't favorable, and in that case, maybe I should lose because the law is clear and the law is predictable and the law is straightforward. So having perspective on that is one thing. Another is perspective in terms of what it means. Is the loss on the merits? Is the loss on a procedural question? Does the loss ensure the case can keep going forward? Whatever the case may be. But that allows me to put it in perspective for the clients that I have had. Maybe they feel disappointed. The court didn't see it my way. Well, the court didn't see it your way on this, but the court did see it your way on this. And then a third thing from some of the losses I have had is that even in the loss, sometimes there is a silver lining. And so as a Court of Appeals judge, I would work hard to communicate that in my decisions.
How would you translate the loss of explaining a loss to an agency on an appeal and explaining it to an individual? You think you can make that transition?
Absolutely. Agencies still are individuals. They're made up of individuals. And so I have pretty close professional relationships with individuals at a lot of my agencies, and they care deeply about what their agencies are doing or have done that may be challenged. And I think I am up to the task.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hartkopf.
Thank you. Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon.
You note in your application that 70% of your litigation has been in administrative law. Can you talk about how that kind of specializing in that would help you if you are to serve on the Court of Appeals?
Yeah, a lot of disputes in the state today touch on administrative law in some way. Two pretty prominent examples throughout the pandemic we've seen. Disputes can involve who has what authority, what agency is allowed to do X, what agency has the authority to order Y. And I know how all those processes work, and I don't think it can be understated that perhaps the administrative law area is a little unseen sometimes, but when it is seen, it's in a big way and it has important consequences, and I know and realize what those are. Another example that you see a lot of publicity about recently are the pipeline issues going on with carbon pipelines or oil pipelines, whatever those may be. Those all are part of an administrative process through the Iowa Utilities Board. And so again, I have this base knowledge of what those processes are supposed to look like and am able to identify when they may have gone awry.
Commissioner O'Brien?
Thank you. Do you use ADR very much in your capacity with the Attorney General's office? And if not, why not? And then the follow-up question would be, do you see any implications for the Court of Appeals to adopt some ADR procedures?
I don't use it formally a lot. I have had mediations in some of my non-administrative litigated cases, and those are helpful because you get the neutral person in the middle. But what I would say is a lot of, while not formalized in the way of a mediation or an arbitration, a lot of the processes that our administrative agencies use are sort of informally resolving disputes. It may be a person coming before the board to talk about this investigative report that was put together or an application they submitted. And it's not a formal hearing because there may not be a judge there. It's not adversarial. It's just having a conversation. And so a lot of our agencies work that way already. As for the possibility of that occurring at the appellate level, I would certainly be open to it. I think it would probably take some promulgation of rules by the Supreme Court authorizing it and setting forth the circumstances under which it can take place and who would be qualified to conduct it and all of those things. But if it would help, I think it's a worthwhile idea.
Thank you.
Commissioner Graber?
I have no questions.
Commissioner Stanger?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What are the top three characteristics that the Court of Appeals judges would possess, and how would you enhance the court?
Number one is temperament. It is just extremely important to have that judicial temperament, always be able to see both sides of an issue. I would do that because sometimes I have to already in my practice, and in perhaps a little more eye roll of a way, you know, I'm very eager sometimes to be the devil's advocate and put out that position when we're talking about cases in the office or anything like that. So I can see both sides. Number two is a clear and interesting writing style. Clarity is so important. I know I told at least one of you that one thing one justice who I wanted to emulate was former Justice Michael Strite because of his humor in his writing style and his ability to make you want to read a case. And so part of that, which is reflected a little bit in the writing samples I've submitted, is that I am not as much of a stickler about contractions in my legal writing. And the reason for that is that's how people talk. And I want my writing to be clear enough that it's like I'm saying it to you. You can understand it in that way. It doesn't have to be full of legalese. And the third quality that I think is really important is having a sense of humor. And I don't mean that in the way that you put jokes about parties in the opinion, but I mean being able to have that perspective and step back and appreciate, you know, again, I'm gonna refer to Justice Strite, but he has an opinion that talks about a battalion of Beanie Babies, and that just kind of gives you a chuckle and keeps the interest level high. So I would be able to do all of those things, I think.
Thank you. Commissioner Henderson?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Hoyt?
No questions.
Commissioner Bevel?
No questions.
Commissioner Hanson?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What is the most challenging litigation you've ever handled, and why?
Well, this may be subject to a little bit of recency bias, but this trial that I just finished, that's a 2-week marathon in the appellate courts, and it's or in the trial court. It's been going on since 2017. It actually had one trip up to the Iowa Supreme Court before trial that I was significantly involved in writing the brief for it. And so just the amount of work that goes into preparing a case for trial and then trying it and managing it, that's very, very stressful. But again, that significant amount of workload is now something that, you know, while I don't think I'd want to be doing 2-week trials back to back to back to back to back. I know how much work it takes, and I know the Court of Appeals takes a lot of work as well. So I'm prepared to meet it.
Thank you.
Commissioner Gray?
Sir, your You're well-spoken, you're well-organized, and you're also quite young. Convince me that you're not too young to be on the Iowa Court of Appeal.
Well, I'm not the youngest applicant, number one.
Okay.
Number two, I have a significant amount of experience with the relevant things that a Court of Appeals judge needs to do in that short amount of time. And as I stated in the application, you know, at times I wondered, am I too young? Should I just self-select out? But the chair of the commission, and I've seen other calls that said, we need qualified applicants, we need people who are interested. So offsetting a little bit my youth is my passion and my dedication and my interest in wanting to do this and wanting to help, wanting to keep Iowa a great place and keep the judiciary in its high esteem.
Thank you.
Commissioner Picklap,
No questions, thanks.
Commissioner Pearson.
Thank you for your application. Why did you choose the 2 writing samples that you included with your application?
I think there were 3.
Pardon me.
The first one is a academic piece of writing that I did, published in the UNLV Gaming Law Journal. That one I picked, first of all, because it showed a little more laid back of the writing style, and second of all, it was that gambling focus that I kind of highlighted elsewhere in my application. It's a niche subject matter that I know a lot about, I have written about elsewhere, and handle a lot of cases on, and that is an area of the law in Iowa that continues to grow. The other 2, which were briefs that I filed on behalf of clients, I selected for basically the depth of them, right? These were weighty constitutional issues, and in my brief, I went through and really laid out the analysis step by step. At this step, here's how you should rule. Well, if you go to get to this next step, here's how you should rule. And this is a broad perspective of the overview of this whole issue. And I thought those 2 were really great examples of the care and detail that I would provide.
Thank you.
Commissioner Chase.
Thank you for your application. How important do you think diversity is on the Court of Appeals, including geographically, urban versus rural, or even experience?
I think it is important. Geographic diversity can have importance. The important thing about this process, though, is it is about the best minds. And so we're fortunate here to have a lot of best minds in government and in judicial service all around the state. But if you were to decide you need the best mind on the court, that best mind can come from anywhere. In terms of other diversity, yeah, youth experience, well, youth makes it sound like a teenager, and that's not what I mean. But having experience of young lawyers can still be valuable because young lawyers bring a new perspective to the practice always, and I think I am a good example. I work with older, more experienced lawyers. I work with younger lawyers. I spend a lot of time volunteering at Drake to help even would-be lawyers. And so having someone who can kind of be that, it sounds a little Doogie Howser, but this next generation can really move the court forward.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hoytink.
I really enjoyed your answer to question number 13, which described the benefit of your non-litigation legal experience, where you talk about advising agencies or internal stakeholders about interpretations of statute, interpretations of case law, so that they can make decisions. And can you talk a little bit about that process and what it means for those clients and stakeholders who then have to go out and execute on sometimes some very important and very contested matters to the public? How do you go about that process? And why do you feel like it's like at being an appellate judge?
Well, in many cases, again, not all appellate cases are like this, but many appellate cases will be, what does this statute mean? And it has gotten to that point because someone made a decision up front and maybe they didn't think about it, or maybe they did, someone else disagreed, and now we have this lawsuit. And now we have a dispute that requires it to be resolved. And so what makes it important for me doing those things on the front end is hopefully then not to need the lawsuit. Because I can say, based on these cases that have happened, based on these authorities, this is how I think this statute would be read, this is how I think it would be interpreted. accept my advice or reject it, but I think your risk is at X level for a lawsuit, and if that happens, your risk is at Y level that you would lose, and now maybe you've tied up resources, or maybe you've deprived somebody of a benefit, or you've taken somebody's license away, perhaps taken away their livelihood, and that can create negative consequences all the way down. But a lot of what I do on that advice end is really geared toward, rather than having them call me later on and say, hey, I stepped on a landmine, what can you do? This is them coming to me before they enter the minefield and say, hey, do you have a sweeper I could use? And I try to be that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Our time is up. We appreciate your application and look forward to deliberating it later this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.